I'm Michael, and this is a story I wish I didn't have to tell. I was 35 when it happened, just me and my daughter Lily. After my wife Jessica passed away, I moved us back to my hometown, a small place where everyone knew everyone. I thought it would be a fresh start, for me, but mostly for Lily. She was 10, and I wanted her to have the chance to make new friends, to find joy again. I got a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest place, with a paint-chipped front porch and a yard that I could never quite keep in shape. I worked as a delivery driver for a local supply company. The job kept me busy, but it let me be home in the afternoons, which was all I cared about. I needed to be there for Lily. I was doing my best to be both parents, making breakfast, packing lunches, doing her hair, which I could never get quite right. It was just us, trying to make it work. Her birthday was coming up, July 15th. It was her first birthday without Jessica, and I wanted it to be special. I wanted to see her smile, really smile, not the polite one she'd been giving me since we moved. I thought a birthday party would be perfect. She'd made a few friends at school, and I decided to go all out, even hiring a clown to entertain the kids. She'd always loved clowns, or at least she used to. I found a guy online, someone local who had good reviews. He called himself Mr. Chuckles. It seemed innocent enough. The day of the party, everything was set. The cake was on the table, pink frosting with her name scrawled across it, and balloons were tied to the porch railing, swaying gently in the summer breeze. Kids started arriving around noon, their parents dropping them off with smiles and waves. I kept my phone in my pocket, snapping photos when I could, watching Lily with her friends. She looked happy, and for a moment, I let myself believe things were okay. Mr. Chuckles was supposed to show up at 2. At 1:30, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a clown standing there, but it wasn't the guy I'd seen online. This clown looked different. Older, with a faded suit and an eerie, old-fashioned appearance. His makeup was thick, the white paint almost cracking at the edges, and the red of his smile stretched too wide. He held a bag of props in one hand and a bunch of balloons in the other. "Mr. Chuckles?" I asked, feeling a strange unease settle in my chest. The clown nodded, his grin never faltering. "The one and only," he said, his voice deep and almost echoing, as if it didn't belong to him. I should have said something then. I should have told him he was early or that I wasn't ready. But Lily came running up behind me, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. She laughed, and the sound of it made me push my doubts aside. I stepped back, letting him in. The clown went straight to work. He made balloon animals, twisting them expertly as the kids gathered around, laughing. But there was something off. One of the balloons, a dog, I think, popped, and red confetti spilled out, startling the kids. They laughed nervously, but I could see they were unsettled. I tried to catch the clown's eye to ask what kind of trick that was, but he just kept going, his eyes occasionally flicking to me, that painted grin unwavering. It got worse from there. I started noticing that some of the kids were disappearing. One moment they'd be there, sitting on the grass, clapping at a trick, and the next they were gone. I found them eventually, each one crying, hiding behind trees or under the porch. They couldn't explain what had happened, only that they felt scared. I tried to pull Mr. Chuckles aside, but he slipped away each time, always with another trick, another laugh that seemed to echo just a bit too much. The worst part was when he started talking to me. Not just talking, whispering. As he moved past me, he leaned in, his voice barely audible over the noise of the party. He said things that made my blood run cold. He used phrases only Jessica used to say, little things that were ours, pet names, jokes. It felt like a punch to the gut each time, and I found myself gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles white. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else noticed, but the parents were busy chatting and the kids were too distracted. By the time the grand finale came, I was at my breaking point. The clown gathered everyone around, his eyes locking onto mine as he announced a magic trick like no other. He brought Lily up in front of everyone, holding her hand, and for a split second, I saw her face. Uncertain, almost scared. He covered her with a large, gaudy sheet, and then, with a flourish, he yanked it away. She was gone. The kids gasped, some of them clapping, thinking it was part of the act. But I knew something was wrong. I rushed forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The clown just stood there, smiling at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Where is she?" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. He just laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I grabbed him by the collar, shaking him, and the makeup on his face began to smear. Beneath it, I saw something that made my knees go weak. It was Jessica. Her face, pale and twisted, her eyes staring into mine, empty and cold. I stumbled back, my hands trembling. The clown, or whatever it was, took a step closer, its grin widening. I felt like I was drowning, like the world was closing in on me. I turned, my eyes scanning the yard, and that's when I saw it. A mirror propped against the side of the house, half hidden behind a stack of chairs. I ran to it, and there, behind it, was Lily. She was curled up, her eyes wide with fear, but she was there. She was real. I grabbed her, pulling her close, my heart pounding as I looked back at the clown. He was gone. Just gone. The kids were crying, the parents rushing over, confusion and fear spreading through the yard. I didn't say anything. I just held Lily, feeling her small arms wrap around me, her tears soaking into my shirt. We left town the next day. I didn't bother packing much, just threw what we needed into the car and drove. I couldn't stay there, not after what happened, not after what I saw. But even now, miles away, in a new place where no one knows us, I still hear it sometimes. That laugh. Faint, distant, like it's coming from just beyond the walls. A reminder that some things, no matter how far you run, will always find you. Story 2. My name is Ryan. Back in late November, I was 29, fresh out of a messy breakup that left me feeling pretty lost. I'd always been a movie buff, the kind of guy who could spend hours getting lost in old films. So when I saw an opening for a night shift security guard at the old Rialto Theater downtown, I jumped at it. It seemed perfect. Quiet, low stress, and best of all, a chance to surround myself with the nostalgia of an old movie house. The Rialto had been shut down for years, but the owners were planning to renovate it, and they needed someone to keep an eye on the place in the meantime. The theater itself was something out of a different era. All faded grandeur, with peeling red velvet seats and walls that had once been lined with golden Art Deco trim. It had character, even if it was crumbling at the edges. My job was to do a couple of rounds each night, make sure no one broke in and log any unusual activity. Pretty easy money, really. I heard the rumors about the place almost immediately. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened in the dark, that the old projector had a mind of its own. I figured it was just stories, the kind of urban legends that seem to follow places like the Rialto. Besides, I wasn't the kind of guy to get scared easily. At least, that's what I told myself. The first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that let your thoughts spiral if you let them. My rounds were simple. Check the lobby, walk through the theater itself, and make sure the side doors were locked. It was on my 5th night when I first saw something strange. I was walking down the main hallway that led to the projection room when I noticed it. A small, clown-themed trinket sitting on the counter of the concession stand. A tiny figurine, no more than a few inches tall, with a painted grin that looked almost mocking. I frowned, picking it up and turning it over in my hands. I hadn't seen it before, and I'd been making my rounds diligently. I set it back down, trying to ignore the unease that settled in my chest, and continued my shift. The next night, there was another one. This time, it was a small balloon, red and half deflated, tied to one of the velvet ropes that lined the entrance to the theater. I stared at it for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that someone was messing with me. But deep down, I could feel that something was wrong. It was a week later when I saw the clown for the first time. I was making my way through the narrow hallway that led to the projection room, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the end of the hallway, just for a split second, I saw it. A figure dressed as a clown, standing perfectly still, its painted face turned toward me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone. I hurried to the end of the hallway, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just an empty corridor and the echo of my footsteps. A single red balloon lay on the floor where the clown had stood. I started to dread my shifts. Each night, I'd find something new. A clown mask draped over one of the old seats, a piece of film tape tied in a bow, a plastic squeaky nose sitting on the counter. It was like the theater was playing some kind of sick game with me, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. One night, as I walked through the theater, the old projector flickered to life on its own. I nearly jumped out of my skin, the sudden whir of the machine cutting through the silence. I turned, staring up at the projection booth, but there was no one there. The film that played was in black and white, a grainy reel of some old clown performance. A clown dancing, its smile wide and eyes empty. I watched, transfixed, as a shadow moved across the screen, a shadow that didn't belong. The laughter started after that. I heard it in the hallways, echoing through the empty theater, bouncing off the walls. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it followed me. I even heard it when I got home, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I'd cover my ears, trying to block it out, but it was always there, just at the edge of my hearing, like a distant memory I couldn't shake. Then came the note. I found it one night, taped to the seat where I usually sat during my breaks. It was a strip of old film tape, the kind they used back when the Rialto was still in business. Written on it, in smudged black ink, was my ex's name, Emma. I felt my stomach drop, my hands trembling as I turned the tape over, trying to make sense of it. Was she involved in this? Was someone trying to mess with me? I hadn't talked to Emma in months, not since she moved out, and we both agreed it was for the best. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, that someone had found out about my past and was trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The theater knew things. Things it shouldn't have known. The final straw came 2 nights later. I was in the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to shake the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. I looked up, catching my reflection in the cracked mirror. And that's when I saw it. Behind me, standing just over my shoulder, was the clown. Its face was twisted into a grin, and in its hand, it held a knife. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty restroom, the air thick with the scent of mildew. I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal trash can, and hurled it at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands trembling as I backed out of the restroom, my eyes darting around, expecting the clown to step out of the shadows at any moment. I quit the next morning. I didn't bother giving notice, didn't even bother picking up my last paycheck. I just left. I couldn't stay in that place, not after everything that had happened. A few weeks later, I heard a story, something about the Rialto's history. It turned out the theater had once been owned by a man who wore a clown mask, a man who had stalked his exes, who had used the theater as his hunting ground. They said he disappeared, that he was never caught. I don't know if what I saw was real or if it was just my mind unraveling, but I do know one thing. I haven't looked in a mirror since. Not really. I avoid them, afraid of what I might see staring back at me. Afraid that somewhere in the dark, That clown is still there, waiting, grinning, just out of sight. Story 3. My name is Emily. Last August, I was 24 and fresh out of college. I had just started my first real job, and honestly, I was feeling pretty disconnected from everything. My boyfriend Josh had moved back to his small hometown, a place I had only visited a couple of times. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, the kind of place that made me feel like an outsider. Josh insisted that I come visit for the annual carnival, swearing it was the biggest event of the year and would cheer me up. I wanted to feel closer to him, so I agreed. We arrived at the fairground on a warm evening in mid-August. It was packed. Families with kids holding cotton candy, teenagers running around with carnival game prizes, and booths lined up with all sorts of fried food. It should have felt festive, but the moment I stepped out of the car, a strange feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't anything obvious, just an odd sense that I couldn't shake. Josh squeezed my hand, his grin bright and carefree, and I tried to match his enthusiasm. The carnival was old-fashioned, almost vintage, and there were clowns everywhere. Not just performers, but decorations. Banners with grinning clowns, colorful posters that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. The clowns performing seemed to fit the theme. Their costumes faded, their smiles painted on just a little too wide. I didn't like them. I hadn't mentioned it to Josh, but I'd never been comfortable around clowns. Something about the masks, the painted faces, made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it and just enjoy myself for Josh's sake. We walked around, played some games, and tried a few rides. But as we moved through the fairground, I started to notice something. One clown in particular seemed to be everywhere. He wasn't performing like the others, just standing in the background, watching. When Josh and I were at the dart booth, I saw him leaning against a booth across the way, his eyes fixed on me. When we were in line for the Ferris wheel, I caught sight of him again, his painted face just visible through the crowd. Each time, he seemed to be mimicking my expressions, smiling when I smiled, frowning when I frowned. I told Josh, but he just laughed it off. My name is Emily. Last August, I was 24 and fresh out of college. I had just started my first real job, and honestly, I was feeling pretty disconnected from everything. My boyfriend Josh had moved back to his small hometown, a place I'd only visited a couple of times. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, the kind of place that made me feel like an outsider. Josh insisted that I come visit for the annual carnival, swearing it was the biggest event of the year and would cheer me up. I wanted to feel closer to him, so I agreed. We arrived at the fairground on a warm evening in mid-August. It was packed, families with kids holding cotton candy, teenagers running around with carnival game prizes, and booths lined up with all sorts of fried food. It should have felt festive, but the moment I stepped out of the car, a strange feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't anything obvious, just an odd sense that I couldn't shake. Josh squeezed my hand, his grin bright and carefree, and I tried to match his enthusiasm. The carnival was old-fashioned, almost vintage, and there were clowns everywhere. Not just performers, but decorations. Banners with grinning clowns, colorful posters that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. The clowns performing seemed to fit the theme. Their costumes faded, their smiles painted on just a little too wide. I didn't like them. I hadn't mentioned it to Josh, but I'd never been comfortable around clowns. Something about the masks, the painted faces, made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it and just enjoy myself for Josh's sake. We walked around, played some games, and tried a few rides. But as we moved through the fairground, I started to notice something. One clown, in particular, seemed to be everywhere. He wasn't performing like the others, just standing in the background, watching. When Josh and I were at the dart booth, I saw him leaning against a booth across the way, his eyes fixed on me. When we were in line for the Ferris wheel, I caught sight of him again, his painted face just visible through the crowd. Each time, he seemed to be mimicking my expressions, smiling when I smiled, frowning when I frowned. I told Josh, but he just laughed it off. It's a carnival. Their suppose. It's a carnival. They're supposed to be weird. You're probably just imagining it, he said, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. But I wasn't so sure. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, but that sense of unease only grew. Later, while we were watching a juggling act, I reached into my bag to grab my phone, and my fingers brushed against something cold and hard. I pulled it out. It was a small clown figurine. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. I knew I hadn't put it there. It was painted in bright colors, its grin wide and mocking. I showed it to Josh, but he just shrugged. Someone probably dropped it in there by accident, he said. You're getting worked up over nothing. I tried to believe him. I really did. But as the night went on, I kept finding them. In my pockets, in my bag, even tucked under my jacket. Small clown figurines, each one different, each one with that same unsettling grin. It felt like someone was leaving a trail, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being targeted. Around 9, Josh offered to get us some food. He left me by the carousel, telling me he'd be right back. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and then I waited. The minutes ticked by, and he didn't come back. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic started to set in, and I pushed my way through the crowd, my eyes scanning for any sign of him. The carnival seemed to close in around me, the lights too bright, the music too loud. I could hear the faint sound of calliope music playing from somewhere, eerie and out of tune. I spotted him eventually, sitting on a bench near one of the tents. Relief washed over me, and I hurried over. But when I got closer, my stomach dropped. He was sitting beside a clown, the same one that had been following me all night. Josh looked dazed, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't really there. The clown turned to me, its painted smile widening as our eyes met. He raised a hand and waved, slow and deliberate. I grabbed Josh's arm, trying to pull him up, but he barely reacted, just looked at me like he didn't recognize me. My heart pounded in my ears as I pulled Josh away, my eyes never leaving the clown. He just sat there, watching us, his smile never faltering. We moved away from the tent, and I managed to get Josh to snap out of it, but he seemed disoriented, like he couldn't remember what had happened. I told him we needed to leave, but he insisted he was fine, that I was overreacting. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get out of there. Before we left, Josh convinced me to play one last carnival game, one of those rigged ring tosses. I wanted to refuse, but he looked so earnest, and I didn't want to upset him more. I tossed the rings, missing every time until finally one landed. The vendor handed me a stuffed toy, a clown, of course. I took it reluctantly, but when I turned it over, I felt my blood run cold. Stitched into the back, in red thread, was my name. I dropped it, my hands trembling. I turned to Josh, my voice shaking as I tried to explain, but before I could get the words out, I saw him. The clown, standing at the edge of the booth, watching us. I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched over to him, my heart pounding, and I yelled, demanding to know why he was following me, what he wanted. He didn't say anything. He just reached up, grabbing the edge of his mask and pulled it off. I felt the ground drop out from under me. It wasn't just a stranger under the mask, it was someone I knew. It was my ex, David. His face was twisted into a grin, his eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. David, who I hadn't seen in over a year. David, who I thought I had left behind when I moved away. He took a step toward me, and I turned, grabbing Josh and pulling him with me as I ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. We drove away, the lights of the carnival fading into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that David was still there, watching, waiting. I reported it to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. The carnival claimed it was all part of the act, that David had every right to be there. Artistic freedom, they called it. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, the look in his eyes, the way he had followed me, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. That one day I'll look over my shoulder and he'll be there, smiling, just like he was at the carnival. And I know that no matter how far I run, he'll always find me. Somehow, some way, he'll always be there.